This video is part of Learning Module 14 in CDFS 412. I'm your narrator, Dr. Moylanen. In this video, I will present some key findings from the 2011 YRBSS, comparing the results for West Virginia to the rest of the United States. All of the data I discuss in this video are publicly available in the publication cited here. If you're interested in learning more about the YRBSS, please visit the link on the screen for the full report. The data I'll present today are drawn from the YRBSS, which is short for Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, which is a research program run by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, otherwise known as the CDC. There's a great deal of information available about this study on the CDC's website. This research involves large-scale school-based surveys, which are conducted all around the country every 2 years, starting in 1991. A large, nationally representative sample of students enrolled in the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades answer a short survey about their health and risk behaviors. They come from most states in the country, including West Virginia. Now, the questions you answered in last week's survey are very similar to those in the questionnaire that the students answer as part of the YRBSS. This was very deliberate on my part. The YRBSS focuses on 6 families of risk behaviors, which CDC and other experts view to be the most important health risks for young people today. The list keeps growing, and they keep adding new questions to the survey each time it's used. For example, the section on behaviors that contribute to unintentional injuries and violence included questions about texting while driving in the 2011 survey. But these questions were obviously not present in the 1991 survey. Now, other areas of priority include alcohol, tobacco, and other substance use, sexual risk-taking behaviors, dietary behaviors, and physical activity. I'll present on a subset of these topics today, but of course, if you're interested in learning more about other topics, you can access this information on the CDC's website or in that report that I linked to earlier in this video. Today I'll provide information about 2 different samples, the national sample and the West Virginia state sample. The national sample is quite a bit larger than the West Virginia state sample, and the participants were drawn from areas throughout the country. The West Virginia sample includes a subset of West Virginia counties. On the CDC website, there's more information about which ones participated. Both samples are approximately 50% female, but there are some dramatic differences in terms of racial and ethnic composition. The national sample looks more like our country as a whole, and the West Virginia sample looks more like West Virginia. The population of West Virginia is a bit different than the country as a whole. So now to the results. I'll start with results for several behaviors in the area of violence and unintentional injuries. The first of these is drunk or intoxicated driving. The results for the U.S. national sample are on the left side of the page, and the results for West Virginia are on the right. Girls are in red, boys are in blue, and the average across boys and girls is in green. This is the same organization and color coding scheme that's used for the rest of this video. So for intoxicated driving, boys were more likely to engage in this behavior than girls overall. Sorry, PowerPoint is not wanting to cooperate as I make this presentation. There we go. Or not. So for intoxicated driving, boys were more likely to engage in this behavior than girls. But overall, West Virginia teens were slightly less likely to report ever engaging in this behavior in the past month. So those differences are slight, but this is still good news for West Virginia teens. Turning to carrying weapons, this news is not quite so positive. Again, boys were more likely to do this than girls, but this was particularly the case for West Virginia boys, with a difference of 9% between West Virginia boys and boys in the national sample. I've previously discussed this finding in face-to-face sections of this class, and my students seem to think it has something to do with the popularity of hunting in West Virginia. I'm not entirely convinced, and I wish that this question had been more specific about what it means to carry a weapon. What do you think? This is something that might be important to discuss as a class as part of this week's learning module. On a more positive note, West Virginia teens of both sexes reported lower rates of physical fighting. These differences between West Virginia and U.S. teens overall are quite dramatic. So what do you think might be going on here? Could this be because West Virginians are usually pretty nice people? Or might something else be going on entirely? Now we'll shift gears and discuss internalizing problems, including depression, considering suicide, and eating problems. For depression, the results are somewhat surprising. As we see nationally, girls are more likely to report ever being depressed than were boys, but overall, West Virginia teens were less likely to report feeling depressed than the national sample of teens. This is great because it demonstrates that something is working well in West Virginia, a state that really has seen its share of hard times. But what does it really mean? Regarding suicide or considering suicide, we see a similar pattern. Girls are more likely to report considering it than boys, but the percentages are again lower in West Virginia than they are for the national sample. So whatever is going on to help reduce depression rates is likely also helping here. So might religion come into play? Religion seems to be very important to young people in West Virginia, and suicide is taboo in many faiths. So could that have an influence? What do you think? The picture is not quite as positive regarding eating problems. Again, we see that girls report higher rates of fasting than boys, but rates of fasting are higher for both sexes in West Virginia than they are in the national sample. Why might this be? And we see a similar pattern regarding bulimia-related behaviors of vomiting and taking laxatives. Girls are more likely to do this than boys, but the rates are somewhat higher for both sexes in West Virginia than they are in the nation as a whole. Turning now to substance use, the final section of this presentation. I've provided the most information here because there are some interesting patterns visible in the data. Starting with cigarette use, it's clear that West Virginia teens are more likely to report ever smoking than teens in the nation as a whole. The same gender differences are present in West Virginia as in the nation. Boys are more likely to report this than girls, but in West Virginia, notice the difference between boys and girls is smaller. So why might be West Virginia teens be more likely to smoke? We don't grow tobacco here, but it is a southern state, and rates of smoking tend to be higher in the South than they are elsewhere. But might there be some unique cultural element? What do you think? A different pattern emerges for alcohol. Girls in West Virginia report similar levels of alcohol use as girls throughout the nation, but alcohol use is lower amongst boys in West Virginia than in the U.S. In West Virginia, boys were quite a bit less likely to use alcohol than were girls. So what do you think might be going on here? Could it be an issue of access? Could boys be substituting with other substances? And if that's the case, then what other substances might they be using instead? For marijuana, it was revealed that West Virginia teens are less likely to have ever used it, but this is particularly true here for girls. Boys in West Virginia are similar to boys throughout the country, but girls here are much less likely to report ever using it. Again, could this be an issue of access, or are there cultural factors at play that are unique to West Virginia? Perhaps unsurprisingly, West Virginia teens were less likely to report cocaine use than their national peers. But again, this is particularly true for girls than it is for boys. Again, these lower rates for West Virginia are possibly due to the relative inaccessibility of cocaine, but why might this gender difference be present and so pronounced? Given the other results, the findings for inhalants surprised me. West Virginia teens are less likely to report ever using any inhalants. But again, this was more true for girls than it was for boys. Boys in West Virginia were only slightly less likely than boys throughout the nation. But for girls, this difference was considerably more dramatic. Again, what is unique about this context that might produce this difference? Now, don't laugh at the phrasing for the question for heroin, because it reflects the age of the researchers with these dated terms for heroin. These findings are somewhat perplexing. In the nation as a whole, boys are more likely than girls to report heroin use. But again, this difference was more pronounced in the West Virginia sample than in the US sample. Boys in West Virginia were quite a bit more likely than boys in the national sample to report heroin use. This is a worrisome finding. Heroin is a growing problem in West Virginia, particularly in rural communities. So what might be going on for these boys in particular that would lead them to use it? For meth, the pattern present in the nation as a whole is also generally visible in West Virginia. More boys report usage than girls, but as with heroin, we see higher rates in West Virginia boys than we do in boys in the national sample. Maybe some of the same factors are at play as with heroin. Meth is also very common in rural communities, but what might be keeping girls from using it that's not present for boys? For ecstasy, the findings are perhaps not so surprising. West Virginia rates are quite a bit lower than the national samples rates, and this is true for both boys and girls. I suspect that this could be due to access. Ecstasy is often used as a club drug. Teens in rural areas probably don't have a lot of access to it or use for it. But I'm not from West Virginia, and ecstasy wasn't around when I was a teenager, so I really have no real insight into this. What do you think could be going on? Last but not least, prescription drug use, which is a growing problem nationally. West Virginia teens were somewhat less likely to report it, and this was true for both boys and girls. This is good news for West Virginia teens, although those rates are still quite a bit higher than we'd like to see as professionals. So to sum up across all of this data, in many ways West Virginia teens are similar to the nation as a whole in terms of their risk behaviors, but it's a mixed bag. On some risk behaviors they look good, and on others the picture is less favorable. Specifically, it's a good thing that West Virginia teens are less likely to engage in physical fights, but it's worrisome that they are more likely to carry weapons. It's great that West Virginia teens appear to be less depressed, but it's still cause for concern that they seem to have more eating-related problems or potentially actual eating disorders. The picture for substance use is particularly mixed. Tobacco use is higher, and of course that's not good. But for girls in West Virginia, rates of usage of other substances other than alcohol are lower than the national figures. And generally, girls' figures are quite a bit lower than boys' rates. So some things are working well here to prevent or dissuade you from some risk behaviors, but there must be other risk factors present that are operating on other behaviors, particularly encouraging some scary substance use in boys. I know I've just thrown a lot of information at you all at once. My goal is to get you thinking about why we might see these patterns and what they might mean. So think about this. Bring your thoughts to this week's discussion. Tell the class what you think works in West Virginia. Why might we see these patterns? What do they mean? What's unique about teenage life in this particular context? I look forward to discussing your insights in the Learning Module 14 discussion board. And this is the end of this presentation.